afternoon, or I guess it's good evening, class. This is obviously an opportunity. I wanted to take an opportunity today to talk to you about a very important moment in American history, a pivotal time in the history of our young republic, and that is the critical period. Critical period is the dates 1781 to 1787. It is the time period, obviously, as the revolution is coming to a close, but ultimately, and it ends with 1787 being the formation of the Constitutional Convention, ratification of the Constitution, 1787. The critical period is defined as the time of it's a period of time in American history in which the United States was under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was the first ever written constitution to serve as the basis of the original government of the United States. The authorship of the AOC, as we call it, the authorship of the AOC was mandated by the Second Continental Congress as the war was drawing to a close. And so there's many different ideas that we want to make sure that we understand in this unit. Obviously, the AOC does not last, but we want to really seek to understand how is it that we get to 1787 and the Constitutional Convention, because ultimately the AOC will be replaced by the Constitution. And so we want to be able to outline its failures. We want to be able to outline its successes and understand why it is that why the AOC did not make it. But one of the first topics that we need to address before we hit the actual AOC is APUSH students need to understand what impact did the American Revolution have on American society, politics, foreign policy, the economy, and what changes were brought on by the American Revolution. Okay, and so we'll go ahead and address that at the very beginning. I think it's important to note that the DBQ in 2005 actually addressed this issue quite well. And so that being said, let me find it here. The DBQ in 2005 asked, to what extent did the American Revolution fundamentally change American society? So make sure you write that down there. It is in the PowerPoint on my Google page under the critical period. Under the PowerPoint, the fifth slide addresses really a very important big picture question. To what extent did the American Revolution fundamentally change American society? And of course, the question asks students to address political, social, and economic effects of the revolution from 1775 to 1800. Okay, to 1800. Now, there is a professor of American history at the Harvard University. He is considered one of the foremost experts on the revolution. He wrote a book, won the Pulitzer Prize, called "The Radicalism of the American Revolution." Now, it's ultimately what we have to understand is that if you go back to that question, to what extent did the American Revolution change American society? There are historians that will argue that very little changed, and of course there will be historians that argue that indeed the revolution did produce tremendous change in American society. Well, Gordon Wood is one of those guys who believes that the revolution was the most radical, far-reaching event in American history. Radical meaning most change. It produced the most change, changed the country the most, more than anything that has happened in our history, and far-reaching, meaning that an event that did more to change not only American society, but the world. Okay, the world. And so, all right, very good. So, in order to defend his thesis, Mr. Wood talks about 5 topics. He gives 5 pieces of evidence. Number 1, he states that the one of the impact that the revolution had on American society is it put the interests and prosperity of ordinary people, what Jefferson called the pursuit of happiness, the goal of government. So the American government established on a local, state, national level will be the first to put the interests of ordinary people first. And that is a tremendous shift in the world. We are the first working government to actually be based on that idea. Now, when we talk about pursuit of happiness, we use the word opportunity, that we are a nation of opportunity. People have opportunity to be successful. Did we live according to that idea, that revolutionary idea? Not really. I mean, it took us a long time for the words pursuit of happiness to really truly mean something. But ultimately, over the course of the 240 years since the revolution, we have evolved into what Jefferson hoped that we would be, and that is an opportunity society, a society where the government exists to benefit not just the aristocrats and not just the wealthy, or as some people say, the 1%ers, but to represent and to put the interests of ordinary folks, to make their interests a priority. The revolution also changed the personal and social relationships of people. It destroyed, it began the process of destroying aristocracy. To label oneself an aristocrat in American society after the revolution was political suicide in order to do that. And so really what came out of the revolution was egalitarian thinking. One of the major ideas of the revolution is this idea that all men are created equal. And so our founding fathers and those that established this new government did so with the idea that we were going to carry along, that we're going to carry the torch of egalitarianism. And so did we immediately become a country where all men were created equal and were treated equal under the law? And the answer again is no. So a lot of those historians that argue that the revolution really didn't change us immediately, that is correct. These changes were slow, but ultimately, because of the egalitarianism and this revolutionary idea of equality and all men were created equal, we will see after the revolution, for example, all of the northern states will abolish slavery. Of course, Pennsylvania will have a gradual Emancipation Act in which slavery will disappear in Pennsylvania over the course of a number of years. We also have in Massachusetts, we have more of an immediate abolition of slavery. But because of the idea of egalitarianism being so important to what the revolution was, we find that as soon as the war is over, the egalitarians begin to abolish slavery. We see the emergence of a women's rights movement. And even though rights for women will obviously become very painfully slow, it is definitely moving. And we'll talk about later, the Abigail Adams, quote, "Remember the ladies," and her efforts to try to get her husband John in the Congress to see to it that when the new government is born, that new government put women in consideration of increasing their rights, both political and economic rights, changing those to make that a priority. Ultimately, the social standing of women will not change, or the social standing of women will change after the revolution. One of your note card terms is the Republican motherhood. Women emerge from the revolution with the idea that they are to train their children, they're to teach their children, raise the children to be virtuous citizens of the new republic. And that was to, in American society at that time, that was deemed vital. In order for our republic to survive, the belief was, and our founding fathers believed, and you read all about this in Joseph Ellis's Founding Brothers, that they really truly honestly believed that the future of the new republic, the future of the new republic resided in the holding true and dear what we call Republican virtue. Republican virtue is this idea that people put their interests, their personal interests, well, let me restate it, that the interests of the nation come before your own personal interests. And so that's what we find with our founding fathers. They practiced what they preached, and we will see in Founding Brothers time after time where the founders will put the nation ahead of self, not ahead of political party, not ahead of their state or their local government, but they're going to put the interest of the American people first, and they're going to put their own personal interests last. And so our founders believed that as long as Americans were virtuous, and they put nation ahead of party, and they put nation ahead of personal interests, then the republic would be strong and would survive. And women were entrusted with the responsibility of building this very important characteristic of virtue into the children. During colonial times, women were viewed, more biblically, that women were weak, they were timid, they were not to be trusted with power. They were not to be trusted with power, and they weren't. So really, in colonial America, women are third-class citizens, and but the status of women will change after the revolution, in large part because of the role they played during the war, and serving as nurses and spies, and assisting in the battlefield, and keeping the farms going while the men were off fighting, and keeping the businesses afloat while the men were off fighting. So they come out of the war with the wind to their back, and again, they don't necessarily achieve the equality that our founding revolutionary ideals promoted, but the women's rights movement will get jump started as a result of the revolution, and not just the women's rights movement, but the rights of all Americans, regardless of the color of their skin, their social status, their economic status, whether they were immigrants or native-born Americans, men, women, you name it. The revolution has started and does start a rights movement in this country. And one thing I tell that I want you as my students to know, and I've told every group that I've ever taught, is that we are still today fighting the American Revolution. We are still trying to see to it that the ideas of the revolution are still alive today. So today we are fighting as much for individual liberties and rights, now than we did back in the 1780s after the end of the Revolution. So American history, one of my guy I worked with many years ago, a professor at Sam Houston State University, James Olson, he told a class one time, I was working at an academy over a summer, and he said that American history is one continuous civil rights movement. It's one continuous rights movement that the further we get away from the revolution, one thing that will always be true is that Americans are always going to keep that torch lit, the torch of equality lit, and they're going to carry it forward. We're always going to fight these rights, these battles over rights. The revolution, third point, major shift and change in American society due to the revolution is it brought respectability and even dominance to people who for a long time were often held in contempt. We're talking about the underclasses. The underclasses, average, ordinary Americans, really come out of the revolution with they become major stakeholders in society, whereas prior to the revolution, they really hadn't been. And so the revolution gave dignity to their, what we would think is their menial labor, which was really unprecedented in history. There's no other place in the world in which ordinary people were stakeholders to the extent of in America at the end of the revolution. Number four, the revolution brought an entirely different kind of government, but more specifically, a new kind of politics and a new type of office holder. Office holders that are elected by the people, represent the people. George Washington, of course, will serve as the kind of the model for what every office holder should be. In that regard, you need to really focus on George Washington and Founding Brothers in the chapter The Farewell. And you really learn how important he was in establishing precedents and the fact that he's going to set an example for future generations of leaders in terms of democratic government and holding office in a democratic republic, in a democratic form of government. And so lastly, number five, what the revolution did is it freed Americans economically. Okay, we had political freedom, we had this social mobility, equality. So we had social freedoms, but now we had economic liberties that are going to be released. I think it talked about that the revolution unleashed powerful new entrepreneurial energy, commercial energies. You could almost feel the shackles and chains being removed off of the American people after the end of the revolution. And now Americans felt free to engage in the free economy and began to do very well. So really, we talk about how the revolution endures, today with our idea of equality and all men are created equal. And we're an opportunity society. We're an opportunity society in which our job as Americans is to knock down barriers to opportunity, barriers that we ourselves have created. But we have to also understand that the revolution freed us economically, and the major successes that Americans have had in developing new technologies, inventing new things, innovations, largely come from the American Revolution. It started the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, prior to the Civil War, and of course, really a lot of the economic success our nation has today traces back to getting rid of the empire and divorcing ourselves from the British Empire. So also other impacts of the American Revolution on society, we do see, as I mentioned before, a rise of anti-slavery societies. We see a thriving abolition movement in Pennsylvania. Knowing who the Quakers were, that should not surprise us. That should not surprise us. But slavery is going to be present. Anti-slavery movements are going to be present in all northern states, including Virginia. And so when we get into the Federalist era and beyond, we will spend more time really addressing the issue of slavery in the early republic. But definitely slavery. We see the rise of anti-slavery societies. We talked about that stronger emphasis on equality. In 1785, Jefferson in 1786, is going to draft the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. And so this is the creation of a separation of church and state in his state of Virginia. And just know that when it came to putting together the U.S. government, this new national government, we will model what Virginia does. Virginia really sets an example. So what Jefferson does in Virginia, we ultimately do, for the entire nation. We see that obviously one major change after the Revolution is we are no longer colonies; we are now states. And so during the Revolution, the colonies were ordered to begin to draft state constitutions. And in these state constitutions, we see the emergence of three-branch governments, states that are sovereign. That means they're self-governing, the ability to rule themselves, that they are not subject to outside interference. Republicanism is just simply the practice of electing representatives, and that the sovereignty of the government resides from the people when they vote and they elect representatives to government. And of course, these state governments featured constitutions that had Bill of Rights, and Bill of Rights ultimately are put in there as protections from tyrannical government, to protect them from a tyrannical government. I think what you find out right away is that Americans are very leery of tyranny. They're very weary of tyranny. American Indians no longer had protection from the British after the war, so Americans began to desire moving west. So manifest destiny and Western expansion, the Revolution paves the way for that with the absence of the British. So now, when it came to the Constitution making in the states, remember the sovereignty of the new states resided in the authority of the people through representative government. Most of the states required annual elections. So the idea that we elect people to serve a certain term of service, that was something that was new. One thing I definitely want you to know is that in these early constitutions, that they all created weak executive and judicial branches. And so because they were scared to death of tyranny, they were really concerned about giving too much power to any one individual. And so that's very important. That's very important. So, all right, let's see. Normally, most of the power would be given to the legislative branches, and when it came to the states, a lot of the poorer western districts of these states were better represented than they were during the colonial period. So now let's talk about one of the AOC. Let's talk about the articles. Kind of the Revolution, the critical period in many ways was a lot more dangerous. And I believe I touched upon this in class. We talk about how the critical period was in many ways more dangerous than the actual war was. So what is the danger? Okay, first of all, the economy. The number one problem the nation was facing after the Revolution is that the condition of the American economy was we were in a pretty bad place economically. We had massive national and state debts that were left over from the war. We had no way of paying for those debts. We were broke. And the new national government under the AOC did not have the power to tax. So there was really very few ways for the government to raise revenue, to begin to pay our taxes. It couldn't levy tariffs. It could not directly tax the people through excise taxes and the like. The only measure by which the new national government under the AOC could raise money was through land sales, something which they did, but the money was very slow coming in. We had also had through credit, we had run up really high bills during and after the war. And so by the time the war was over, America had a very poor credit record. And so we had a very difficult time getting other nations, other countries to loan us money. So we had really the debt issue is massive. I mean, individual Americans were in debt to British merchants. And so even individual Americans had a very difficult time paying off their debts, including farmers. Farmers, of course, are amongst the hardest hit. And when farmers can't pay their debts, they end up losing their farms because they can't pay their mortgages. And so ultimately, the banks, the people who own their mortgages, seize the farms. And so that ultimately is what's going to move us towards the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. And so there is a major crisis in agriculture during the 1780s. Also, our currency, we not only did we lack currency, but the currency we did have was very it was worthless. It was very there wasn't enough gold and silver to give our currency value. And so, of course, that causes inflation. And we'll talk about inflation. Inflation essentially causes prices to be very, very high, prices on everything. And so prices are the lack of currency is a major problem. And the fact is that the British are undercutting us. They're flooding our market with cheap products, and it's making it very difficult for American companies, American industries to make things, American factories to make things and to sell them because they can't compete with the lower priced British products. Something else that was going on after the Revolution, which ultimately worked out very well for the Americans, and that is the Loyalists. The Loyalists will leave; they'll flee the country. Okay, many of them will flee the country after the end of the Revolution, and so that ultimately was good for us because when the Loyalists leave, and of course 80,000 flee to Canada, about twice as many leave and return home to Great Britain. You have a portion that will flee to the British Indies down in the Caribbean. But with the loss of the Loyalists, when the Loyalists flee, they leave behind their land, and we never really ever They never really ever compensate the Loyalists for their loss of property. And so what the Americans do, they seize their land holdings, they confiscate their land holdings, they cut up the confiscated land into small farms and distribute it amongst the poor farming class, the poor folks. And so what that did is it really accelerated what we call economic democracy. Economic democracy is this idea that before all white men could vote, so before white males had the right to vote, they had land. And so the reason why ultimately there wasn't a counter-revolution after the war is that, as there usually there's some type of counter-revolution or instability, is because Americans after the war were very happy by the fact that there was a plentiful amount of land for everybody. And so economic democracy preceded political democracy. And the whole idea is, as long as I've got land, then one day I will have the right to vote. I will have the right to vote. And so that is a very important development. And it's a big reason why we succeeded in those early years. But economically, and really another problem faced by Americans after the war is trade. The British made it very difficult for us to trade overseas. They, in many ways, acted to block American trade with the continent, with continental Europe, and as well as other places. But what that did in the long run is it forced Americans to become more self-sufficient. They forced us to have to survive without the outside world, and we had to kind of turn inward, become more self-sufficient, develop our own factories, and begin to slowly wean ourselves off of European-made products. And so I think that one thing that's definitely a fact is that Great Britain is bitter. I mean, they're very bitter about the war. They refused treaties, to sign treaties with us, economic treaties. They refused to abandon their forts that they had on American soil. The British also were engaged in kind of turning Indians against Americans that were living in the frontier. And so the British, of course, also after the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the British, they don't recognize us as an independent nation. And so we ultimately feel like there will be a second war with Great Britain, which ultimately is the reason why we formed the AOC. We formed the AOC for defense, because we are better together in terms of our security than we are apart. And so the states decided to bond together in a confederation and for mutual defense. But considering all the things that the British were doing to us, the AOC Congress couldn't do anything because the AOC did not give the national government the authority to control commerce, to maybe develop a tariff policy. Tariffs, of course, are taxes on imported goods. So there's no way of doing these things. And so that's also another weakness of the AOC. Also, another foreign policy, and in addition to what the British are doing, we're having a problem with the Spanish. At the time, the Spanish will close the mouth of the Mississippi River in 1784. And like the British, they will also incite Indian attacks against Americans, especially, in the Georgia, down there in the South. It was definitely a major problem. So, as well as others, we had a problem with the Spanish in regards to, we had land claims that we couldn't agree on, especially in what's called West Florida. And they also conspired with Americans to try to set up a rival country to the United States made out of land in the Southwest. And that's going to involve Aaron Burr down the road. I think we will learn a lot about that in Founding Brothers when it comes to that first chapter. Learn about Burr and all that. And of course, France was also a problem after the war. Now, of course, they were our ally. They're a big reason why we win the war after the Battle of Saratoga. It's at the Battle of Yorktown that the French come to our aid and really help secure our victory. But as soon as the war is over, the French began to demand immediate repayment of money that they had loaned us during the war. They began to restrict our trade with their navy. So the British and the French were guilty of restricting our trade with continental Europe and with the Indies, with the Indies, with the Caribbean, until those debts were paid. So that was a major problem. And our economy, you got to understand, the American economy in the 1780s is built on trade. It's built on trade. It's built on exports, exporting our tobacco, our agricultural products, our manufacturing goods in New England. And so the problem with trade is really the root cause of a lot of our economic problems in the 1780s. Another foreign policy challenge we had would be the Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates had influence in the Mediterranean. These pirates were based out of North Africa in Tripoli, in what is modern day Libya. And these pirates, now that we no longer had British protection of the British Navy, these pirates, man, it was open season on American commerce, American merchant ships in the Mediterranean. And so, and they would oftentimes, they would seize our ships, kidnap our sailors, and then hold our merchants and sailors for ransom. Some were even enslaved. So, but ultimately, like I said, you know, going back to the AOC, the AOC will be ratified in 1781. As the AOC is ratified, the major issue, there were some states that refused to ratify because they were very angry. And so the big issue was land. A lot of the smaller states were very angry that a lot of the bigger states, like Pennsylvania and Virginia and the like, the smaller states were very concerned that a lot of the larger states, how they owned a lot of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so a lot of the states that did not have a lot of land claims west of the Appalachians essentially said that they weren't going to ratify the AOC until these other states surrendered that territory. And ultimately they do. And so, but we definitely, we get a AOC, and the AOC was extremely weak. It had very little power. It had little, if any, more authority than the United Nations would have, some 200 years later. Let me read you a quote that's on the PowerPoint. It said that one historian wrote, "The AOC government could ask for money, but not compel payment. It could enter into treaties, but not enforce their stipulations. It could provide for the raising of armies, but not fill the ranks. It could borrow money, but take no proper measures for repayment. It could advise and recommend, but not command." And so ultimately, think about it, guys. You've got a young infant country that has a lot of challenges facing it, and there's no way to deal with these problems. There's very limited ways in dealing with these issues. And so the AOC also was a bit of a joke. A lot of men who served in the AOC they really weren't men of high stature. They hardly ever had enough men to even conduct business. They had a hard time having quorum. Quorum is essentially defined as having a sufficient number of people in the room to do business. Each state, 13, each state had one vote. So there's 13 men in the room. So if 5 are gone, if 4 are gone, they can't do business. And so the AOC, what made it very ineffective is that it couldn't even get business done. It couldn't get business done. In order to pass a bill, it required 2/3 vote. What I want you to look at, think about it. How many bills today in Congress get a 2/3 majority vote? How many bills would pass today under this thing? The AOC government had one branch, which was a Congress. It had no president. It didn't have a judicial branch. And so, because it didn't have a judicial branch, that anytime there was a dispute between the states, there wasn't a judicial branch to mediate the dispute. Meditate. I'm talking meditate. In order to amend the AOC, it required a unanimous vote. So all 13 states would have to agree. So in other words, just the way the AOC was set up, it had very limited success in even passing legislation. Obviously, the greatest weakness of the AOC, and you need to know this, is that it could not tax. The power to tax was reserved for the states. Okay, it couldn't regulate commerce. It could not impose tariffs. It couldn't print money. And since it couldn't deal with currency issues, then it had no way of dealing with the inflation that the economy was suffering from. And it was so weak that anytime we had these revolutionary challenges, anytime we do see violent uprisings, the government was too weak to effectively deal with the violence. And so the United States, during the critical period, was on the verge of anarchy. It was on the verge of spiraling out of control violently because of the government's ineffectiveness in dealing with the problems faced by the people, especially those at the bottom end of American society. I want you to pay attention to the revolutionary challenges. Two examples, of course, one would be the Nuremberg Conspiracy, and the second one would be Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion. One of your one of the required things you have to do for me is watch that video on Shays' Rebellion on my Google site. Okay, so make sure you do that. The one thing that the AOC did well, okay, I'm not going to be a negative Nancy or a Debbie Downer here. One thing they did really, really well is land policy in determining what to do with all of the land outside the Appalachian Mountains. And so two laws are going to be enacted. One, the Land Ordinance of 1785. That's a note card term. Land Ordinance essentially parceled up the land in what's called the Old Northwest. The Old Northwest is the territory located west of the Appalachians and north of the Ohio River. Okay, and then in 1787, one of the most important early pieces of legislation in American history is the Northwest Ordinance. Northwest Ordinance established guidelines as to how a territory becomes a state. And so you have, for example, Americans moving west. They're settling in the frontier territories in the West. As these territories gain population and they hit a certain population number, then these territories can apply to become a state. And of course, it set up the guidelines as to how, what does a territory must have? What must a territory do in order to become a state? And one of the big requirements is, the two big requirements in order for a territory to become a state is it must reach a certain population, and they must draft a constitution for that state. They have to draft, and so that constitution, of course, would then have to be approved by Congress, and then Congress would give its blessing as to whether or not a territory becomes a state. And so that's the Northwest Ordinance also, and it's very, very important we know this. The Northwest Ordinance established that all new states created above the Ohio River would be free states. No slavery, would be free states. And so that set a very important precedent. The Northwest Ordinance established the precedent that some states will be free, some states will be slave. And so it really established that precedent of the free North and the slave-owning South. Okay, and so and what are Americans doing? What are Americans doing? Americans are in the process of forbidding slavery. I mean, so this is an example of Americans forbidding slavery. And so also it's important under the Northwest Ordinance is that as new states are admitted, every state is equal. There's no one state that's more important. Now, we all know that Texas is special. We all know that Texas is, in large part, better and bigger than everybody else. I know that's biased, but really, through the eyes of the American government, whether you were the first state ever to enter the Union, Connecticut, or the last state to enter the Union, Hawaii, they're all equal. Okay, there's the oldest state and the youngest state are all equal in the eyes of the national government, and that's what the Northwest Ordinance stipulated. So in an effort to save time, I am going to skip over Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion, you'll get in the video. Shays Rebellion definitely leads to the Philadelphia Convention. So I want you to be familiar with the steps that lead to the Philadelphia Convention, okay? And the Constitutional Convention. And Constitutional Convention, of course, every state sent representatives except for Rhode Island. Their leaders were appointed by the state legislatures. And so when it convened in May of 1787, there were 55 delegates. What did they all have in common? They were all rich, they were all white, and they were all conservative, okay? And so that's exactly what kind of document we get. Now, the purpose of the Philadelphia Convention was to simply to revise the AOC, but what they end up doing is they end up scrapping the whole thing. They end up scrapping the whole thing. And so, let's see here. I'm still trying to check this whole thing out, trying to figure out how this all works. Ultimately, I'm going to eventually have it to where we've got, where instead of looking at me, you're going to be able to see the screen. I tried to do it today, but every time you do it at school, it freezes up the computer. So pretty crazy stuff, man. Pretty crazy. So, but what they do is, you know, at the Philadelphia Convention, it's attended by, you know, these guys who are they're very young compared to what we had at the other Philadelphia meeting in, you know, the Continental Congress. We had a lot of fresh faces there. But ultimately, there were some people who were there that were kind of the major players at the Philadelphia Convention. Obviously, James Madison, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. George Washington is elected president of the convention, and he only talks twice. Of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of meetings, which, by the way, they were all held in secret. No one was allowed to take notes. Now, ultimately, James Madison, at the end of each day's business, would go home and he would write down the day's transactions, what happened at that day's session. And so what we know of what happened in the Constitutional Convention is large part due to Madison's recollections. But because Washington was there, it gave seriousness to that meeting, a serious tone to that meeting, that this is like really important business. There were a lot of nationalists that were there, a lot of anti-nationalists. I mean, like states' rights people, people like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, those folks. Those people did, by the way, those people didn't attend. That's what I meant to say. But a lot of the men in the room were nationalists. And so, and that's exactly what kind of document he gave. If you want to understand why the Constitution is the way it is, you just have to look and see who is there and who participated in it. But obviously, James Madison is prominent as a player at the Constitutional Convention. He is called the father of the Constitution for essentially bringing in three major ideas into that document. Okay, number one is the idea of federalism. Federalism is the idea that states share power with the national government. Okay, federalism, and that the federal government drew its power not from the states, but from the people. It is very important you know that. Okay, it's very important you know that when Madison crafted the Constitution, he created the Constitution under the idea of federalism. That means there's going to be power sharing between the federal government and the national government, between the national government and the states. Excuse me, the states and the national government would share power, but when it comes down to it, the national government would have supremacy over the states. National supremacy. Guys, that is the biggest difference between the AOC and the Constitution of the United States, is that the AOC, most of the power resided in the states, and the AOC, or in the Constitution, the power, the national government was supreme. In fact, the part of the Constitution, it's called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause is what gives the national government supremacy over the states. Okay. Second major idea that goes into the Constitution that Madison put in there is the idea of separation of powers. The idea that we're going to have a 3-branch government: executive, legislative, and judicial, that each branch would have powers over the other. Okay, this is called checks and balances. All right. And so checks and balances exist to prevent any one branch from becoming tyrannical. So again, you start to see, once again, how our founding fathers are, in the back of their mind, they are very, very sensitive about tyrannical government. Okay. And so the third major idea that he brings in is the benefit of what he called an extended republic. A lot of folks criticized that, how can we have a representative government? How can we have representative government over such a vast continent? How can we be so big? How can we have a representative government over such a large area? And he said, we can do it, but he says that is actually a benefit because we're so large. The likelihood of that any one faction, and by the way, back then the word faction meant political party. Faction meant political party. So because we're so large and we're so extended, that it's a way it would help prevent any one faction or any group of self-serving politicians from ever threatening representative government. So he brought in those three, and for that he's given a lot of the credit for the major change. So really what we had in Philadelphia is we had an overthrow of the government. We got rid of the AOC and replaced it with something that was completely different. So really what the Philadelphia Convention was, it was a peaceful overthrow of the government. Okay, they scrapped it. Instead of revising the AOC, they scrapped it. Now, one thing you definitely need to know for this unit as well is the various compromises that went into making the Constitution happen. The fact is, the men in the room didn't agree a lot. And so in order to have a functioning government, in order to get the Constitution, by the way, is very vague, because they really wanted to see to it that the Constitution could be changed. They wanted to create something that could be changed. And if it's broad enough and it's not very specific, then they could change the Constitution. And it could, over time, it could be good for all times. The Constitution is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, constitutions in the world. And it's gone through very few changes. And the reason why it's gone through very few changes is because the way it was written. It was written to be very broad. But what made the Constitution ultimately succeed? And of course, Joseph Ellis in Founding Brothers, I want you to make sure you read all about this, okay? In the opening chapter, The Generation, he talks about the miracle in Philadelphia, how what happened in Philadelphia, how miraculous it was that they were able to create such a functioning government, and the fact that it's still what it is today. It is a tremendous thing. And think of what happened in Philadelphia, that Philadelphia was a continuation of the American Revolution. We're taking that victory in the American Revolution. We're taking those ideas upon which we fought and which many men died, and we're going to take those ideas and we are going to apply them, to the new government, So, and that's what they hope to bring into the room as well. But compromises, guys, just to save time. I'm going to have to just save time. The first compromise is going to be the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise dealt with, and this was the biggest debate that they had. This is one of the biggest conflicts they had. It was between the large states and the small states, population-wise, and it was over representation in Congress, over how was the Congress going to look, what was the Congress going to look like. And so they all agreed that it would be a two-branch government. But the large states, they wanted representation, i.e. the number of men elected into both houses. They wanted representation to be based on population, okay? And that was part of what's called the Virginia Plan. The state of Virginia stepped up and they said, hey, listen, we think that representation should be based, the larger states should have more power. They should have more representatives in both the upper house and the lower house. And of course, then the small states got been out of shape, and led by New Jersey. New Jersey offered what's called the Small State Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and they called for a singular Congress that had one house, and it was based, and that it'd be a Congress in which each state had an equal number of representatives, no matter how big. No matter how small, each state would have two, and they couldn't agree. And there was an impasse. In fact, there were men who were ready to walk out of the room, and they came up, the delegates from the state of Connecticut, Mr. Roger Sherman, authored what was called the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise conceded that population should be based on determining representation in the House of Representatives, and in the upper house, the United States Senate. Each state would receive two. Each state would receive two. In the House, of course, the House is supposed to be closest to the people. It's directly elected by the people. The senators would be selected by the legislatures. That was changed in 1916 with the 17th Amendment. Today, we get to directly elect senators, but originally, senators were selected by the state legislatures. Interesting thing about the House would be where all tax bills, all taxes, spending bills, when the government spends money, it all originates in the House. A tax cannot be promoted by the Senate. And there are certain powers that the Senate has that the House doesn't have. So and then we all know that in order for, hopefully we know, that in order for a bill to become law, both houses have to agree through majority vote. When it came to the executive branch, the Founding Fathers at Philadelphia in Article 1, they created a President of the United States. Now, this also, huge difference between the AOC and the Constitution is, and I'm telling you, this really shocked people. It shocked people about how powerful the office of the president was. But ultimately, why did they create an office that was so powerful when they're so worried about tyranny? And the answer is they knew who that first president would be. And that first president would be Mr. George Washington. And they trusted Washington with power. And they believed that during the critical period, during this very dangerous period where we got all these domestic problems, economic problems, foreign policy problems, that we needed a strong figurehead to see us through these stormy waters. We needed we need someone commanding the ship who knows what he's doing. And that's what George becomes. And of course, George, once he becomes president, he establishes precedents for people to follow, that future presidents would follow. Of course, another compromise would be the issue of slavery and representation is the 3/5 compromise. Of course, the 3/5 compromise, they fought over whether or not Southern states should be able to count their slaves in determining population in terms of how many congressmen they get. And so the 3/5 compromise is passed, but what the northern states get out of it is an end to the slave trade. And so in the Constitution of the United States, slavery is mentioned. First of all, slavery is protected under private property. There is a fugitive slave law, or there's a fugitive slave portion of the Constitution where Americans were deemed by the Constitution, Americans were required to return runaway slaves back to their masters. Okay, of course, it's the 3/5 compromise, and of course, the end of the slave trade. The Constitution states that in 1808, slavery would end. The slave trade, the African slave trade would come to an end, which unfortunately by then, by 1808, there's enough slaves here to have a domestic slave trade. So, but ultimately that's where slavery is located. Now, going back to the president, they did state that the president would be elected. Of course, the president he's the head of the army. He's the commander in chief. They're going to put, the army, the army is going to be led by a civilian control of the army. So commander in chief, president has wide sweeping powers to appoint people, appoint judges, and veto, the power of veto, to veto acts of Congress. The Electoral College, of course, would be established to elect the president rather through direct vote. Electors would be chosen by the states, and they would cast their votes individually, and which really what the electing of the president was done by just a handful of people. Okay, just a handful of people. Now, ultimately, the big constitutional issue would be how would the Constitution be interpreted? No card term you need to focus on is the loose versus strict construction. According to the Elastic Clause, Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution states that Congress has the power to make laws that are quote unquote necessary and proper. And so that is going to create for these Americans a huge debate as to what that phrase means. And so strict constructionists believe that that the government can do only what it specifically says it can or cannot do. Okay. Loose constructionists believe that the Constitution has implied powers. That means that even though the Constitution doesn't say that the government can't build nuclear weapons, it does say provide for the common defense in the preamble of the Constitution. So it doesn't say nuclear weapons, but it does say provide for common defense. So so you got strict construction versus loose construction. This idea that there are powers in the Constitution that they're not stated directly, but they're implied. And so that's going to create a huge constitutional debate that we still have today. I mean, that's how we're different. Americans still fight tooth and nail over constitutional issues, and that's one of the big ones. Last but not least, I want to just touch upon a couple more things. Know that the people in Philadelphia did put inside the document what were called conservative safeguards. Really, what they were scared to death that one day average, ordinary, uneducated, illiterate people would vote. Okay, in fact, they called them the mob. The mob. They're very afraid because of the mob. They thought the mob, what's going to happen the day, what they really wanted to prevent, they wanted to create a government in which the mob, the people, all right, the average, ordinary, illiterate masses, they were worried the day when they would be able to vote. And so what they did is they included in the Constitution safeguards to see to it that the learned, the intelligent, the literate, the rich and powerful would have power. And so we see it, for example, with the Electoral College. We see it when the fact that the United States Senate, those senators are selected by state legislatures, not by direct election. You see the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court is filled by the president. The president makes appointments. The Congress approves those appointments. And so there's really only one part of the government which is actually democratic, in which the mob has their say, and that's the House of Representatives. Now, today, what we've done is over the last 230, 40 years is we have watered down those safeguards. We've made it to where ordinary Americans, the mob, as we say, can participate, and they have a greater voice in the government, okay, in the government. And so you can make the case, I mean, I can make the case, anybody can make the case that at that time in the 1780s and the 1790s, we needed to trust the government to the talented, those that were talented, those that were intelligent, those that knew what they were doing. We didn't really need, at the time, we needed the intellectual elite to step up and get us through those really early, difficult years of the Republic. That argument definitely could be made. So knowing that later on down the road, more power would be passed down to everybody in the country. Ultimately, Thomas Jefferson, the reason why Thomas Jefferson was such a huge advocate for, the reason why he was such a huge advocate for education of common people and the masses is because he knew that once the masses became literate, then they can be trusted with the right to vote. So even, I mean, and Jefferson he's as elitist as the next guy, but he did want to see the power be distributed to more and more people as long as they were educated. That was his big deal. The last part, of course, the critical period comes to an end with the ratification. And now that the Constitution is approved, the ratification, of course, was not easy. It went to the states. They wanted every one of the states to ratify, to approve. And the biggest hang up that people had with this new Constitution is that it lacked a Bill of Rights. They were opponents of the Constitution, or what we call the Anti-Federalists. They were very alarmed at how much power the national government had. They were alarmed at the absence of a Bill of Rights. They thought the Constitution favored the wealthy and threatened the rights of common people. They were, like I said, states' rights. They believed that most of the power should reside in the states and not in a federal government. And so in order to get all of these states to ultimately approve, they agreed to add a Bill of Rights, which was done in 1791. It was actually one of the first accomplishments of George Washington when he enters office. As we see, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are added in order to satisfy the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were opposed to this new Constitution. The Federalists were the ones that supported ratification. So this is the genesis of the first two political party system, the two-party system. Online, on my Google site, you will see that I have charts showing the differences between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. You're going to need to be able to compare the two, okay? And I also have charts online, the differences between the AOC and the Constitution. So those are definitely two important comparison questions that you need to be prepared for next week. So anyway, guys, I'm done. With a new functioning government with the ratification in 1788, George Washington will be elected. They will hold the first elections, and he becomes our first chief executive. And we will, in 1788, he's elected the first president of the United States, and he is now steering a brand new government under a new document, the Constitution, and now he's facing a litany of national crises and national. There's a lot of priorities that he needs to deal with, namely, again, the economic troubles, foreign policy challenges, the revolutionary challenges that we're facing, and equipped with a brand new government, he's going to try to steer our course through these issues, and that'll be our next unit of study. So, ciao, guys. We'll see you later.